Alright guys, this is Stories from My Dad Part 2. This won't be as long as Part 1, I don't think. But anyway, some of the other, one of the other stories was, and this was in, in when my dad was in the Army in the Philippines, this one. And I think then the other stories that I might talk about are sort of after, in more like in civilian life. Um, but and I will mention something else. But let me first talk about this story. There was actually there was a guy that young guy, that my dad. I don't know. He was in his platoon, young army guy, and my dad mentioned that and he was a good-looking guy and everything, but he was very naive, and he sort of fell in love with a working girl, let's say, okay, over there, in the Philippines at that time, and 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 my dad and one of his buddies, was trying to tell him, hey, don't trying to bring him back down to earth, like, hey, don't be falling in love over here, basically, right? Just in general. And but especially, this was I'll just say she was a working girl, um, and and he was just adamant about it, though. He was just like, he thought he was in love, and maybe it was his first time or something, you know what I mean? It could have been like his first sexual experience, so maybe that's why he fell in love. um, but well, what wound up happening was, I think one of my dad's buddies um, kind of brought him back down to earth and actually kind of took him to where she was staying, and sort of, opened the door or whatever. I don't know if they were in a room somewhere or in a tent or what, but she was actually entertaining two guys at the same time. Okay, let's put it that way. And my dad's buddy just kind of like had to. The only way this guy would, he could convince this guy that it's not a good idea to fall in love with her. It was he showed him what she was doing, with other guys, and so it was kind of crude, but it was what this guy probably needed to see to finally figure out that it wasn't a good idea falling in love with her, and so yeah, so he did. He kind of showed him, he literally showed him that, kind of came into the room or whatever, opened the door or whatever it was, and he was able to see that she was entertaining two other guys intimately at the same time. And so that's all I know. Like, I didn't sort of go on and on about it, but he just said, yeah, we had a guy like that, and he said he was a real handsome guy too, young guy. I forget what he said. He looked like Robert Taylor, some actor. He reminded him of like some actor at that time. But he said, yeah, and anyway, and I won't say which buddy of his, is the one that ultimately had to show him, kind of bring him down to earth. But anyway, that's what happened. Um, there's a couple other things here. Well, I will say this, because this is related. My dad, he got malaria, when he was in the Philippines, and but he didn't really have any attacks. Like, he didn't have any bad attacks or anything while he was in the Philippines. In fact, he didn't really know that he had malaria until some years later, and it could have been 20 or 30 years later, when he was going to give blood to a relative, who needed it. Who was going to have like an operation or something, so they were looking for, blood donors. And then my dad had the same blood type as him, It was my uncle, actually. Or not my uncle. Well, whatever. It was a relative on my mom's side. Let's put it that way. And when my dad went to give blood to him, they took some of my dad's blood and they tested it, and they said, "Sir, you can't. You have malaria. You can never give blood." To anyone, like going forward. at all, you know. And my dad was like, holy shit, you know. But of course, it didn't surprise him, you know. He's like, yeah, you know. But it's funny how he never really had any attacks or anything when he was in the Philippines. I think he might have had a few bouts with it, but maybe he didn't know exactly what it was, you know, in a civilian life, like later, you know. Uh, but anyway, so that's how we found out he had malaria, though. You know, he goes, "You still got malaria in your blood, sir. You know, you can't give blood to anybody. You know, you can't donate blood to anybody." And this was like I said, this had to be 20 years, maybe 30 years later. You know, but it was at least probably 20 years later. So anyway, that was kind of an interesting story. Uh, there's something else I wanted to talk about. It's kind of difficult to probably talk about, but because I know that people have heard about this happening in Vietnam, you know, in the war, you know, about certain officers getting like what they would call fragged, you know, basically by their own guys, you know, so I don't know. Anyway, let me just say this. I'll try and get through this delicately as possible, but you know, in combat, if you're a lieutenant, it's a very important position, you know, to be, because you're in charge of your platoon, right? You know, really. I mean, there's sergeants, but then ultimately the second lieutenant is the one who's of that platoon, who's the one who's really in charge, right? Supposed to be. However, if you're an officer and you don't really know what's going on, as far as, you know, you're a brand new officer out of like West Point, and now you're coming into a situation where you're now experiencing, you know, jungle warfare, not the standard warfare that they often teach about, I think, in schools like West Point. You know, more like their teachings tend to be more about standard combat practices in urban environments, in normal environments, like what we experienced in World War II in Europe. You know what I mean? Going into buildings and, you know, maybe house to house type situations, or just, you know, it's just kind of normal, a little bit more normal combat terrain. You know what I mean? And situations and land. You know, and they're not. And at least at this time in World War II, we had very limited experience with jungle warfare. And I don't think it was taught very well or very much in West Point at that time in World War II. So some of these officers would come to the Philippines and they were just out of school and they really didn't know what the hell they were doing, you know, and especially pertaining to jungle warfare. And they were often targeted. You know, they were obviously, officers were targeted by the Japanese. You know what I mean? And we targeted their officers too, you know, whenever possible, because especially with the Japanese, their one drawback for them as far as being as soldiers was that, you know, oftentimes if they lost their officer, like if a Japanese platoon lost their officer, there wasn't always necessarily a guy like a sergeant to step up and take the place of that officer, because they had kind of a hierarchy society, okay, in Japan. Everything was like, oh, this guy's the boss, you know, you listen to him. It's almost like he's the emperor and you're just a peasant, you know what I mean? And they had that mentality where, you know, the upper guys were king, you know what I mean? And the lower guys would just do what they told them, what the upper guys would tell them to do. And they didn't really have that sort of like jump into that spot mentality where, oh, now I'm a sergeant, I got to take over the platoon. So oftentimes our U.S. guys would target their officers, you know what I mean? Because if you want to destabilize that whole platoon, man, just kill their officers, you know? And because the sergeants weren't automatically sort of stepping up to take their place, you know, like they are in the U.S. Army, okay? So you know, you had that sort of mentality. But anyway, concerning our officers that were very raw and green and unexperienced, if they sort of had the wrong mentality when they came to the Philippines, the smart ones, let me put it this way, the smart officers that came out of West Point and went into the Philippines, for example, and this was probably the case with Vietnam as well. The smart ones would listen to the sergeant. They would just go right to the sergeant, and you know what I mean? Like they would sort of be guided by the sergeant, because the sergeant knew what the hell was going on. You know what I mean? They were doing this. They were in control of these guys. They were with these guys. They were in combat. They were experienced. They knew what the hell they were doing. Okay. But the officers that didn't do that and thought that they knew every damn thing, you know what I mean? And they weren't gonna, you know, rely on, they weren't gonna go under the wing of some sergeant. You know, I'm an officer. You know, they had that mentality and flashing their insignias around and all that. Those are the guys that got killed. Okay, and you know, and oftentimes, you know, most of the time, obviously, they got killed by the enemy. You know, by the, you know, in this case, the Japanese, because they were literally wearing their insignias too much, and you know, showing their insignias too much, even when they were out on patrol and stuff. You know, because my dad learned when he already knew when he got that commission to be second lieutenant from sergeant. He knew not to be flashing around the fact that he was a second lieutenant. Like he didn't want the Japanese to see that he was the officer. You know what I mean? When they were on patrol, so you know, he would kind of cover up his insignia and stuff. You know what I mean? Like hide it. You know, which is one of the reasons why he stayed alive, you know. But these other guys, you know, some of these other guys that wouldn't listen to those who knew, right, like sergeants and that, you know, they were getting killed left and right, man, in the Philippines, you know, by the Japanese mostly, okay. Especially because of that insignia thing, you know, and they're just barking orders and kind of making it obvious when they were out on patrols that they were the boss, you know. You know, they thought. So anyway, I'll move on to there's only a couple other items, a couple other stories. One of them was, you know, my dad was a milkman for about 25 years, and most of that time in Chicago, after the war, of course, and most of the time he had his own route, you know, for probably 20 years of that 25 years, you know, or so. And he knew, and would sometimes have lunch with, or whatever, or breakfast or lunch at some restaurant or whatever, with Robert Conrad, you know, who was a famous actor. He was in the TV show Wild Wild West. He was in Black Sheep Squadron, I think, which was another TV show based in World War II time, but, you know, came out around in the 60s, okay, and so was Wild Wild West. He was kind of a big actor in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, I think, and, you know, but he was really big then, you know, and, but before he became an actor, he was a milkman. That was one of his jobs. And so my dad, you know, knew of him, you know, he knew him. And I think he must have had a route probably on the north side, even though he's from the south side, Robert Conrad. But yeah, my dad said, yeah, he was a nice guy, you know. And he also said, I'll just say this briefly, you guys out there my age and will probably know, you know what this means. But he said, yeah, you know what? That guy, you know, he was younger than my dad too, you know what I mean, at that time. He was like probably in his 20s or whatever, like, you know, maybe early 20s. And, you know, he's a good looking guy, you know. And my dad said, yeah, he got more ass than a toilet seat. And anyway, I'll leave you with that on that subject. But you know, because I'm sure this was before he was married and stuff. You know what I mean? Robert Conrad, he was still a young guy at that point, you know. And I got one other story on this to finish this one off. And when my dad was a milkman on the north side of Chicago, one of his customers was a belly dancer. and you know, she used to, you know, they were friends and everything, and you know, like she trusted him. My dad was a good guy, and you know, like she'd leave the door, and this is in the 60s too, right? So, you know, crime wasn't so sort of prevalent, and we didn't hear about every little crime that happened, you know, like you do now in the age of the internet. But anyway, so, you know, at that time, I mean, she'd leave the back door open, and he would just come in the morning and you know, deliver her milk and put it right on her kitchen table, right? And so one morning, my dad, you know, he opens the door, he goes to put the milk on our kitchen table, and there sits a gentleman at the table reading a newspaper, smoking a cigar. And he looks at my dad, and my dad knew who he was, man. He recognized him. He was Chuck English, or Charles English, who was a prominent Chicago gangster. Okay, he was in the Chicago mob. He was one of Giancana's guys, and I think he was also, you know, even after Giancana, well, I don't know, probably even after Giancana got killed, he was still, you know, in the mob. And anyway, so my dad was like, holy crap, you know. He goes, I almost shit, you know, when he's telling the story. He goes, I saw him, I go, I almost shit. And he goes, the guy just looked at him and said, how you doing, kid? You know, and, you know, how you doing, sir? You know, and whatever, or my dad said, you know. and, you know, he didn't really elaborate on it. It wasn't a long, you know, story or anything, but he just said, yeah, you know. Then he said, okay, well, I got more stops to do, you know, and all right, kid, take it easy, you know, and that was it, you know, and my dad took off, you know. But he always told that story, you know, I always got a kick out of it. Actually, Chuck English, what happened with him was he later, he actually was he was involved in the gambling, vending machines, and a few other things like that, you know, not really like a hitman or anything like that, but he was up there, you know. He was kind of one of the upper guys, you know, like in the top. He was supposed to be one of the top 9 guys in the mob at one time, you know, in Chicago. And he wound up sort of retiring to Florida, but then unfortunately he came back later on, like in the early 80s or something like that. Like in the 70s, I think he went down to Florida to sort of retire. But then he made the mistake of coming back to Chicago, like in the 80s, and he wound up getting whacked. You know, like around, I think it was around 1985, okay? He got killed, 2 guys shot him, it was a hit job, you know, and in the parking lot of Horvath's restaurant, which was over by, if I remember right, I went to that restaurant actually a couple of years before it closed for good, you know, like in the early 2000s. Went there a couple times, and I think it was over by, like, what was it, Armitage and Harlem. So it was, technically it might have been in a suburb, like a west suburb over there, like River Forest or River Grove, something like that. But it was, you know, just on the outskirts of Chicago, basically. And but I remember reading about that. I go, oh wow, he got killed. Because I think they thought that he was going to try and nose himself back into the racket, you know what I mean, and be a leader again. And I think one of the other guys that it was the head of the mob at that time decided to get rid of him, you know. But anyway, guys, that's about it for part 2 here. And if I think of anything else, I'll let you guys know. I'll do another audio video on it. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.